Welcome to Season 3 of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, a podcast about the Bay Area, technology, and culture. I'm your host, Sunil Rajaraman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Yasha Kakis-Wolf.
Oh, man. You know, I was talking to my daughter today, and her name's Simone, and she was telling me about graduation for some of her friends in high school and how like school is just wildly different right now. And then I was starting to think about kind of what other kinds of schools, universities, colleges are being impacted in a negative way, in a challenging way right now. And like the list is enormous. But the story in education isn't about just things that are challenged right now. There's actually some really nice stories about innovation that are happening in the world of education right now.
And today we spoke to Austen Allred. Austen is the founder of Lambda School. Now, Lambda has generated quite a bit of controversy, both in the tech world, the non-tech world, et cetera, for their model, which essentially takes a percentage of their students' income after they graduate based on a developer job that they get. And so this has generated some press, but notably, Austen is also a controversial tweeter, which we addressed during this interview. And we learned that, there is nuance to, the personality and how he thinks about tweeting.
I constantly am surprised when we have a chance to meet someone who we've got a very real expectation about who they are because of how we interpret what they do when they're on a place like Twitter. Austen's got a really fascinating business. I think it sounds pretty logical why Lambda exists when you start to talk to Austen about it. And the guy's pretty thoughtful on top of it all. So there's a kind of interesting juxtaposition about how we interpret people showing up and the businesses that they're part of and maybe what they are like in real life.
Definitely. We hope you enjoyed today's interview and with the amount of Twitter consumption that we're doing in this day and age, one of the takeaways that we would hope is there are people behind the tweets always.
People behind the tweets always. I love that. Enjoy. Austen, thank you for joining the show today. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where are you right now?
Right now, I am in a little farming town in rural Utah.
Can you describe geographically Utah and where a little farming town in Utah actually might be?
Yeah, so if you've got Utah, you've got kind of Salt Lake City toward the northern-ish part of Utah, and then down in southern Utah, you have kind of the national parks, and then right in between the two. So I'm probably 2.5 hours from Salt Lake City to the southeast. So if you were to put a pin right in the center of Utah, that's right where I'm at.
Ooh, I bet it's beautiful.
It is. It's a different kind of beauty. It's not lush green. It's more deserty. But we like it here. It's been fun.
Yeah. Hey, wait, you lived in the Bay Area, but you're not a native to the Bay Area. Is that right?
No, I moved to the Bay Area a few years ago, but not a native, no.
Yeah. Where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Utah also?
Yeah, I grew up in Utah. So right now I'm kind of on my in-laws' farms. This is where my wife grew up, and I grew up not too far south of Salt Lake. So I grew up in the city of Utah.
Yeah. So you're not a farmer growing up?
No, very much not. And still remain not a farmer to this day.
Yeah, just a gentleman farmer? Just to look at the sheep and stuff?
And they do hay, but...
That's great. Yeah. Great for the allergies, I hear. Hey, as you were growing up in Utah, right? Did you ever say, I think I want to live in the Bay Area, and so I'm going to kind of figure out what's necessary for me to go from Utah to move to the Bay Area? Was that ever a part of your thought process?
Yeah, basically. When I started going to college, that was my plan. I'd already, I'd been buying and selling stuff on the internet since eBay, the early days of eBay. I had one of the first PayPal accounts. So I already kind of lived in Silicon Valley, just not geographically, and knew that that's where I would end up eventually. But getting there was not as simple as it would have been for some other folks, I would assume.
What do you mean buying and selling?
Sorry.
Sorry, Sunil. We're gonna reinstate the talk over each other fine of $1. And I think I just owed the first $1 in this conversation. So sorry about that, Sunil. Could I ask the one question? I was really curious, Austen, what was buying and selling stuff online? What do you mean by that? Are you like selling sneakers, computer equipment, all kinds of stuff?
Yeah, so I found kind of a hack on eBay search engine that if you just search for iPod, so it was, usually Apple products way in the early days. So think about the first iPods. If you just search for iPod, it would be like, hey, there are 100 million results. You need to narrow your search. But when you listed a product, if you just listed it as iPod, it wouldn't tell you, hey, you need to add more keywords. So there were a bunch of people that would just list their iPod as just iPod. So I basically had a 3-page long search that was iPod, and then I would minus out all of the other words. So I'd find only the listings that just said iPod. You usually buy those for pretty cheap, and so I would buy those and sell them.
So Austen, we are recording this. This is only our second remote podcast, so that is why you're hearing us, talk over each other. We're having to adapt post-pandemic, and all of your, talk about selling stuff online, sort of reminds me of the situation we're currently in, e-commerce booming. What are some of your reflections right now on, the situation that we're facing in the world? You are prolific on this about Twitter, but give us like 3 or 4 takeaways right now, like your hot takes.
Oh man, hot takes. Let's see. So first, I think we're still underestimating the economic impact of the type of unemployment that we'll see and the type of businesses that will be affected. 2, it's created this kind of weird, network of winners and losers that is somewhat random, but I think it will push more activity online. I just got finished reading Ready Player One, and if you've read that, it's kind of about a kid who basically lives in a virtual world. And I'm recognizing that, I go home to my family, but everything that I do from a business standpoint, all of our students are remote, all of our employees are remote. It's becoming more and more possible to just live entirely within that virtual world and have less interaction with real life, which is fascinating. And I think will only hasten that shift.
Is anybody making those outfits that you can wear yet, like Ready Player One?
I'd love that. I don't even have an Oculus, and I think that's kind of a prerequisite before you get haptic gloves or haptic suits. You have to have real VR, not just 2D.
Well on our way to living out Wall-E.
That could be it. I mean, you can DoorDash ice cream and sit in your chair and work online. Yeah, that's totally possible.
Austen, we have to talk about Lambda. So for a lot of our listeners out there, you've come up a lot. Lambda's come up a lot. What I'm hoping is you can just provide a basic explanation of the work that you're doing at Lambda, and just what is an ISA? Why is it the future of education? And anything else you can share about your vision for Lambda.
Yeah, so when we first started Lambda, we were saying, hey, let's put a really, really good code school online. There were a couple of code schools that were online, but I didn't feel like they were very high quality. So it was either you go to San Francisco and then you can really learn to code, or you can do this kind of hacky, janky stuff online. But there wasn't like a true immersive experience that was happening online. So originally we were no different than any other code school. 3 months long, you pay us $10,000 up front. We started talking to the people that were interested in Lambda School and realized that the main thing holding them back was really the financial piece. So we could have, figured out how to get loans, but the risk associated with those loans was so much that, I don't want to take out a $15,000 loan and owe 10% on it if I'm only making minimum wage. That's, in a funny way, that's life altering. That's life ending financially. So, I've worked at a lending company most recently, and it makes you think like, why why are we putting all of the risk on the backs of the students? You know, if I'm a school and I'm saying, hey, I can help you get a job that pays X, why do I get paid if I'm unsuccessful in doing so? And of course, there's, you know, the student has responsibility and the school has responsibility. In order for it to work out, both have to do their part. But that's basically what an ISA is. It instead of traditional loan, so with Lambda School's income share agreement, you pay back only if you end up with a job that pays you $50K or more. And if not, then you don't pay anything. There's a little more nuance that goes into it than that. But what it really does is it lets the school bet on the student instead of the other way around.
Got it. And, really intriguing, pretty, would you call the model controversial at all? And, I only asked that, I was just kind of curious, what are the reactions that you hear on both ends of the spectrum about the model?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it's controversial. I think the average person says, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Why are we sending government dollars to universities no matter what they do, and saddling students with all the debt no matter what happens? Like it clearly aligns incentives in a way that any other mechanism doesn't really. And the negative side is, just kind of their students do owe money at the end of the day if they're successful. And the most common negative argument is, hey, that's indentured servitude. But it's really, I'll try to steelman that argument a little bit before I dismiss it. The criticism is that it's tied to a percentage of income, and that feels vaguely similar to indentured servitude. The huge difference is that it's not. We don't force you to work anywhere. We don't force you to do anything. It's more similar to a loan in that sense, where it's just a financial obligation. The same way you sign a contract with your cable company when you want internet, or your phone company when you want phone service. It's just an agreement to repay. And if you pay it all off, or, and it's capped too. So in our instance, if you pay $30,000, the entire thing goes away. Or, and this is something that the critics don't like to remember, if you don't get a job that pays more than $50K and 5 years of deferment elapses, the entire thing goes to zero and you don't owe anything. So in my mind, very much unlike indentured servitude. But that's the criticism.
I've certainly heard some feedback from kind of broader in the industry, at least I've watched it, coming in saying, here's some maybe pitfalls. I'm really curious about let's call it the education industry generally. Like, are there specific schools or maybe organizations that are looking to you as a driver for change in the way that they work right now? Like, is there a flip side to maybe some of the detractors that maybe we see on places like Twitter that you can talk about?
Yeah, I think we pretty quickly became leaders in the, I'll call it vocational education industry, to the point that, if we changed text on our website, it would, we could watch that flow through a dozen other, schools pretty quickly. So the vocational schools are pretty quick to adapt. And I think we've kind of forced the ISA model on the industry. It's an order of magnitude more difficult to make work as a school. You are carrying risk that you wouldn't have carried otherwise. You are managing a finance piece that you wouldn't have managed otherwise. So it's much, much more difficult to make it work as a school, especially in an environment that's more uncertain, like the environment we're in now. Everybody would just prefer to, collect checks and that's it. So I think we've kind of forced the industry to take more risk on than they would have otherwise, which I think is, at the end, that's the point of capitalism. That's the point of competition, and the students win out at the end of the day. But now it's a matter of who can make it work and who can make it work the best so that the terms are most favorable to the students, so the students will select those ISAs. So it creates a very interesting dynamic where the schools that perform the best have the best rates, and the schools that have the best rates will get the best students, and it creates a little bit of a cycle that way.
So I have so many questions, and one is a revenue model question, and one is just the role of traditional education question. So on the revenue model side, the model sounds like it works extremely well, both for the student and potentially for the employer, particularly in a good hiring market. But what about a situation like we're facing now? Would that be bad for Lambda in the sense that people aren't hiring or unable to pay out the ISA in full to Lambda? Is that so? I'll start with that, and then I'll ask the second question.
Yeah, and so we have to be much more cognizant of hiring markets than the average school would. And if there are shifts in the market, we try to be ahead of those shifts and move students to where people are hiring. So, for example, we've got an entire team that just kind of monitors the hiring landscape. And, in the past couple of months, we used to have a bunch of students go work at logistics companies, or trucking companies have been hit a little bit. Event and experience companies have been hit, and we've shifted all of that. Hiring has shifted more toward healthcare, education, some logistics, still different kind of logistics, financial services. So we have a team that keeps tabs on that and helps direct students to where they ought to be. So at a macro scale, what we are trying to build is kind of the economic clearinghouse of capitalism. So if I'm an 18-year-old that doesn't know what I ought to do, what I should be presented with are kind of here's a menu of options. Here's what you're really well suited for. And that, here are the outcomes and the expectations and the repayment tied to each of those outcomes. But that's not what we provide, 18-year-olds right now. Right now we say, hey, go to the best university you can, study what you love, and we're all just going to hope and pray that it works out on the other side. And when it does, that's awesome. But as the growing student debt shows us, oftentimes it's not working out, and it's not working out at rates that were unprecedented for our parents' generation. So we're taking bad advice and getting saddled with bad debt, and the second order effects of that are pretty bad for everybody. So I think it's just kind of a missing piece of capitalism, something that will tell you where you ought to go, where you ought to work, and help you get there. It's kind of crazy how little assistance somebody has in that regard.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I'm obviously following the collapse of many of our nation's universities in the face of this pandemic. However, what would you say to someone who says, and so I don't think things will totally fall apart. So part of the value in university isn't it that, sort of you see it in the VC world, you've raised a bunch of VC money, but Stanford, Harvard networks are so valuable and impregnable in some ways, not to mention the in-person experience and developing social and, quote unquote, life skills and being around people your age who can challenge your views, et cetera. What would you say is, like your thoughts on that? Because isn't part of that, your ability to be a CEO of a company, your ability to deal with people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so first, I'm not worried about Stanford and Harvard. They're going to be just fine. The schools that are going to be hit the most in this are, and we're already anticipating some of this because there are fewer high school seniors graduating than there have been in the past several years. So we knew there is going to be pain already, but obviously COVID-19 and the coronavirus epidemic will exacerbate that significantly. So I'm not a college graduate, so I can't speak for all of it, but I think what will happen more broadly is kind of an unbundling of education. So the university education is this big bundle of, you have the credentialing aspect, you have the educational aspect, you have the social aspect, you have the party aspect, you have the sports aspect, and there are, all these different things put together in this big package. What Lambda School said is specifically, for some students, that package isn't ideal. And so we're going to break off just the job training piece of that, just the part that helps you get a job. And we're not going to do any of the other stuff. We're not going to have a sports team. We'll have some social events, but it's not going to be you go live in a dorm and hang out with all your buddies and We'll still have networking, but it'll be different. It'll be very, very job focused. And I would imagine you'll see that in other aspects too. I don't know how yet, but I think one of the reasons I dropped out of college is because the majority of the things that they offered and that I was paying for, I actually didn't need or care for. So that's just my experience. But if I were trying to predict the future, I'd predict further unbundling of the higher education system.
Yeah. I sit on the board of a little liberal arts college in Southern California, and I love it. It's my alma mater, Whittier College. Part of what has always been interesting and important and exciting about the college experience is the idea that you can learn about a lot of different disciplines. The benefit and the value for somebody like me is that it provided kind of system thinking as a rigor, and that's been valuable for me professionally. I'm really curious. I certainly appreciate the idea of the unbundling, but I'm really curious how you think about what liberal arts has done culturally, globally, and maybe its relationship into, or the challenges that we're going to see as we start to unbundle higher education, which I don't think is wrong, by the way. But I'm really curious about that, kind of your thought as an entrepreneur who's creating a business that is starting to unbundle part of the educational experience.
Yeah, so I think, if you look at kind of traditional disruption theory in the Clay Christensen vein, it really is a promise that, the good that replaces, that disrupts, is not superior in every way. And I don't think Lambda School is superior in the sense of, we definitely focus a lot on systems thinking, but there's something abstract that liberal arts colleges will provide that we just don't. And so what I think has to happen, I do see the value in that. And I consider myself as someone who is very interested in systems thinking and in the arts. I read more than, I have family members with liberal arts degrees, and I read way more than any of them. And that's not a knock on them. That's just to say, I think that we will either, those liberal arts institutions will continue to provide value to the people who opt for that, which is the most likely option, or you will be able to get the same value in other ways. And I don't know what that is. If I, knew how to provide a true systems thinking, education, I might be playing with adding something like that into Lambda School. But I'm pretty convinced that over time, something will develop that provides a similar experience at a lower price point and may not provide everything, or the liberal arts institutions will continue to grow and thrive. I think, it's no secret that there's going to be a painful period of the next 48 months. But I don't know that I can predict that, liberal arts colleges will cease to exist 4 years from now. I think that would be an unwise prediction.
Yeah. I think that there's something
what's really
pretty fascinating about the idea of kind of unbundling first and then bundling back together. Right? It seems like there's a very natural potential relationship of what you do into maybe a traditional liberal arts experience. And maybe that's a contemplation for you as you think about future product. But that to me feels really interesting. Sunil, sorry, I stepped on top of you. $2.
No, I was just going to say, we kind of talked for a second about sports, and I know that for many of us, it's just a social activity. I was a college athlete. Joshua was a college athlete as well. But it is a huge revenue source for these universities. And so you always get the question, well, why is the football coach the highest paid state employee in every one of these states? Well, it's because no single employee swings state revenue as much as the college football coach, right? And so like you get a program like Ohio State, which generates $200 million of football revenue annually, or Penn State is probably in that neighborhood. UC Berkeley is certainly up there. What are your thoughts on sports in general, Austen? Like, I'm just curious because how will, universities replace this revenue, or is it just one of those things where it's going to, go away? Or any thoughts on this? Appreciate it.
Yeah, the short answer is I have no idea. My thesis would be, there's been some level of pressure around athletes being paid. I mean, the flip side of that argument is, it's awesome that the students in Penn State are getting a free education, but is that really in line with the value that they're providing? And, how should that revenue be distributed? Certainly some should be to the coach. I don't think anybody would argue that, but I think it's going to be a more and more difficult argument as transparency increases that the students who bring in revenue shouldn't be paid or, have something in that realm. So if I were trying to disrupt the NCAA, it would be something where a student is allowed to, be paid some amount and start to, star students away. The tricky thing there is, there's such a strong network effect with NCAA in so many different ways. So I don't know how that plays out. I'm not sure if this fall it will matter what anybody's preference is. I think it might just be there is no college football, but we'll see.
I really like this bundling, unbundling concept that you talked about. I think that there's a lot of meaningful learnings that traditional educational institutions can kind of take away from a conversation like this. I'm really curious, as you think about the kind of graduates from your school, what you have to do to help them, and this is really specifically evolving your product so that they're not in the kind of way of what AI is going to start replacing from a technology perspective inside of businesses. Like, how do you think about future-proofing your students against AI replacing their work?
Yeah, so my first response to that is, I think we need to move to a world where we stop thinking about higher education as something that happens before you turn 22 and then never again. So I think I don't think anybody 20 years ago would have predicted that the world looks just like it is today. And we can try to get really good at predicting, but I don't think we are going to be good enough at predicting that we will know, what is future proof and what is not. You could make the argument that there's some trends and you can say, hey, we shouldn't be, training people to be truck drivers. But frankly, until coronavirus hit, that was among the better careers that somebody could have. And until self-driving trucks are there, that is something that is highly paid and highly needed. So the way I think about it is kind of shortening the cycle. And you think about it very differently if a college experience costs $200,000 and takes 4 years than if it costs $20,000 and takes a year, or it costs $15,000 and takes 6 months. So I think as the economy continues to increase its rate of change, which feels chaotic now, but I would imagine that chaos continues and increases into the future. I could see a world where it's normal to go back to school for a couple of months every 5 or 6 years. And that doesn't feel crazy to me at all. And I would, I think more in terms of that than how do I give you the one education that will get you through anything and everything for the rest of your life. And more to, how can we prepare you to, weather some of that storm, and then if it's just a macroeconomic massive shift that none of us saw coming, make it so that it's not punitive to go back and study something else in the future.
So Austen, we're having this discussion with you. By the way, I think the echo is removed from my sound now because I had my AirPods sitting like a few feet away from me, and I didn't know you can connect two devices simultaneously. I'm so irritated. So it goes.
That's comedy.
But I want to pivot into a conversation about social media. So here we are having this conversation with you, Austen. You're an incredibly thoughtful guy. Of course, we all know Tyler Willis, who's a close friend of mine for decades, and that's how Yasha and I actually originally met. And he said great things about you. But to the casual observer who might just look at your social media presence, they might have different reactions. And so I've been fascinated by how you use social media. You know, you think about things in a clear and nuanced way, but social media is a free-for-all. Tell us about how you use social media and what you might say to people who are like, wow, I want to hate unfollow that guy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always curious when I meet somebody in person. The reaction is consistently, "Oh, wow, you're so different than you were on Twitter," which I'm not sure how I feel about that. That's not my That's not my desired response. I'm not trying to spark controversy or be an asshole or anything like that. Twitter, honestly, is just whatever I'm thinking that's top of mind. I put out on Twitter. And sometimes it's controversial, sometimes it's divisive, sometimes it's wrong. But I try to limit my filter there to the extent that I can, because otherwise it just becomes this polished and rehearsed, PR pitch. And that's just not my style. So I know you tell me if I'm tweeting something that is blatantly offensive. Certainly my comms team has had tweets that they've been frustrated with in the past. But yeah, for me, I just
feel offended. And so I certainly have not walked away from your Twitter feed offended. That's not my personal response, but it's sort of like, if you read something without context, it's like, oh, okay. Does he really think that? Or was it just, like you said, something top of mind? Was it thought about? And it sounds like the answer is no. It's just whatever is top of mind at the moment.
Yeah, I think, that's the reality for me. I can't speak for any other Twitter users or, and certainly I have a PR and comms team that gets varying levels of nervous depending on what I'm tweeting at a given time. But I think what, wins out at the end of the day is like true authenticity. So it may rub people the wrong way sometimes, but just like trying to be, quick and top of mind and being willing to make mistakes, I think is critical on Twitter. I mean, you look at like who grows their following the fastest, and it's not people who are well rehearsed or eloquent, to say the least. I mean, it's Elon Musk and it's Donald Trump, and sometimes they'll tweet stupid things. Well, I'll keep politics out of this, but I think it's not even political to say that sometimes Trump tweets just crazy stuff, and Elon will tweet memes as much as he'll follow up his tweet about a meme with the composition of a rocket engine. And so I think for me, that's what I actually want. I appreciate when Elon tweets ridiculous memes. I think I can't imagine that. It's crazy to me that he still gets away with that, being as rich and powerful and influential as he is. But I find it a little bit endearing. And even knowing that, like, Elon is like a very flawed dude that sometimes will say stupid stuff. That doesn't bother me the way it bothers some other people. Some people, I'm sure, are very, very put off by it.
Well, I know we said that we don't break news, but I thought it would be good for us to talk about the fact that we just heard that Grimes is actually the person that writes all of his tweets. I'm totally kidding.
Oh, really?
No, I'm teasing. Completely teasing. But here's the thing, though. Like, where do you find your outer limits? Like, where are the barriers that you put up for yourself in social media, on Twitter in particular? Is there things that are off limits?
Yeah, for sure. There are things that I mean. Twitter is a medium that is fundamentally lacking nuance. So anything that would get you into trouble if there isn't nuance, I have learned the hard way to keep off of Twitter. So it's basically just all of the controversial topics that come to mind. I avoid politics almost entirely unless it's very, very neutral. I avoid, kind of current events. Think about traditional discussions of power and privilege and race and gender and all the things that are just tricky. I tend to avoid, not because some I don't have opinions on, frankly, or I haven't thought deeply enough. I've actually learned to, people ask me questions a lot on Twitter. And I've learned that one of my most effective responses is like, I've never really thought about that and I don't have a clue. Just being honest and open about when that's true, it surprises people. You're usually just supposed to have an opinion and fight, and I don't always care to. But yeah, I think there are very important and nuanced discussions. And one of me and Paul Graham email back and forth a lot, and he's got 1 million plus Twitter followers, and I've only got 100-something thousand. But his advice to me was, if you have something that requires nuance to say, put it in an essay. Don't tweet it. Because if you need the nuance, the essay format is just not as susceptible to people taking what you're saying out of context, which is, I think that's what's happening on Twitter probably 40% of the time. And then B, the people who just want to have a quick flippant reaction to something and not study it out aren't going to read the essay in the first place. So if it's not, chopped up for them in a quick soundbite, they won't care to read it. And I've noticed, people say stuff about Lambda School that, there's a New York Times article about us. Some of the response was like, okay, you're literally only reading the title. You didn't read the article, which is fine. And you have a lot of opinions. You're going to get a lot of retweets on it. But it's also not going to matter at the end of the day, because you're not actually influencing anybody's opinion. It's just, people are looking for something that confirms their priors, and they're going to hit retweet, and then it's just going to go off into the ether and be done. So I think another thing that I've learned the hard way is I don't have to correct everybody who's wrong, even if it's just they're factually incorrect. And then when I do correct someone who's just factually incorrect, it can come off as condescending or rude or whatever else, even when I'm actually just trying to correct a misperception. So that's some other stuff I've learned the slow and hard way.
We've got a couple more questions, and then we want to close out with I know Yasha has one or two, but this is a really important point that you're talking about, which is the relationship between tech and journalism right now. I mean, it is absurdly bad, and I feel personally a little bit torn by this. So I'm also I'm a multiple time founder. I've raised VC money, and I've been on the negative end of press coverage before. And it's no fun. Now, on the other side of it, we've had journalists on this podcast. I've been a writer. I owned a San Francisco-based publication called The Bold Italic for a few years. Talk about the state of tech versus journalism right now, and is there a path to things getting better?
I'll use the response that I referred to earlier, that is, I don't know. But this is something I've thought a lot about, not thought about. I think what we're watching is, a lot of news publications are going to die in the next 6 months. I don't see, the revenues are declining like crazy. The employee bases are unionizing and becoming relatively more expensive. And there's a collision course set. And I don't see how anybody's going to pull out of it. Especially think about, the traditional VC-backed journalism companies. I think they're in for a world of hurt. And I think some of the animosity toward tech has come from the fact that news media views tech as the thing that is killing their revenue source. And, things used to be awesome if you were a journalist. And they're not anymore. It's a brutal, I actually started a news company. Not many people realize that. I started a news fact-checking company where the idea was to crowdsource some of the journalism that isn't going to happen in the future because it's just too expensive. And so I love journalism, and I love very well done journalism. And the writers today are put in a position where they just can't. I mean, if you're writing for, one of the big VC-backed tech publications today, you have to pump out a couple articles a day at 600 words each. And how can you possibly do that well? You just can't. And so I think what it's turned into is, incentives are what matter the most at the end of the day. And if your incentives are to push something out as quickly as you can that will get as many clicks as you can, you respond to those incentives. So I have to be careful because there's been some negative criticism. There's been some negative press about Lambda School that's been totally fair. And there's been some that's just fundamentally factually incorrect. And
so here on that note, I'm curious because we do hear about the negative stuff on Twitter and all of that. But if we had to rephrase it and say, hey, here are 2 or 3 journalists that Austen respects, who would you point to right now who you think is doing a good job?
I think Alex Conrad at Forbes is doing a really good job. I don't. This is a little bit different, but Ben. Oh, geez, what's his last name? Trajectory. Help me out.
Ben Thompson.
Ben Thompson. Yeah, at Trajectory does a phenomenal job. I'm very interested in kind of the Substack or Athletic model where it's subscriber supported as opposed to advertising supported. I just don't know how advertising supported publications will make it. Kate Clark of The Information has, she reported an article about Lambda School that I didn't love, but it was accurate. And she did her work. And I can't say that for everybody who's reported about Lambda School. So
that's good. I mean, we are kind of breaking news in a way, which is there is a nuanced view of this, and we all know this, and we know that you're a nuanced and thoughtful guy. But there are people doing good work out there, and there are others that it's just not obvious on Twitter all the time because it appears as if the two sides are sort of pitted against each other with no path. And one of these days, we got to get you on a panel with some of these journalists when in-person meetings are a thing again. We want to sit you down with a few folks and see if there's a path forward. That's something I'm really interested in doing at some point.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know how. And I empathize with the news publications because they're just in a really crappy spot right now. And I think their response is going to be to lash out at tech even harder because they view Facebook and Google as the things that have destroyed the revenue model. And, so tech killed journalism. And I don't think that's true, but I'm empathetic to it. And it really sucks. I mean, when I ran a news company, the journalists that we could hire for not as much as they should be making in another world was just crazy. And people who have dedicated their entire lives to news and to journalism and who truly love and value truth, the business model just fell out from under them. And what used to be a well-paying pension, 6-figure job 30 years ago is minimum wage today. And that sucks. So I don't know what the response is there, but I empathize.
So we're going to steer back into social media for a second. I want to seed you with a question. The question is, on the social networks that you spend your time, and maybe like really specifically, let's just talk about Twitter. I want to know who the recommendations are that you have for our followers to listen to.
Oh, I actually have if you go to my Twitter list, I have a list that's called non-obvious. And so if you follow tech Twitter, for example, you're going to constantly be hit with the same people again and again and again. So I've tried over time to curate that list to a few people who are very thoughtful and very nuanced and not quite as popular. So a couple of people that come to mind, Mason Hartman, who's at WebDev Mason, I think is just, she's a very gifted writer. She's intentionally divisive, which I think works well on Twitter. It has a lot of nuanced thoughts. Zach Cantor is another one. ZACKKANTER. If you want to follow more for kind of the fights, I really like Mike Solana, MICSOLANA. Those are, there's a certain threshold of fame after which people tend to tweet less. But those guys are all under that threshold. They're influential enough, but also still under that threshold that they know people and they are having interesting conversations and they're still free to tweet about them. So that's kind of the sweet spot.
Ooh, that's like the home run answer for the question. Thank you for all of those recommendations.
Yeah, Austin, we have to ask you one more question. So can you get Yasha and I into Clubhouse, or what's the deal? Like, can you just score us a couple invites, please?
Probably.
There you go.
That's semi-committal, which we appreciate.
That was not a condition of this interview. I want to make it clear to our listeners. What's it like on there is actually what I just really wanted to ask and close out. Do you think that it's going to be a big thing? Is it going to remain a kind of close set of people? What's the deal there?
Yeah, so I don't know what number user I was. I would imagine I was relatively early. I just got a random link and somebody said, "Hey, you should check this out." It felt very much like early Twitter in the early days where everyone was figuring it out. You'd spend 60% of the time talking about Clubhouse. So what Clubhouse is basically a voice-only kind of think about. It's basically this, but we would be having this conversation more, less scheduled. Just you hop into a room, and then anybody who's interested can jump in, and then you can add them to be a speaker, or kind of demote them to be a listener, kind of move it back and forth. Whoever created the room controls it. So it's one of those things that's largely a matter of who you're in there with. So in the early days, a couple of my favorite conversations were, Naval just talking about, he's talking to different epidemiologists and what the impact of coronavirus is going to be and what the responses are. And so he's just having a conversation, but it's a conversation that you wouldn't be able to listen to otherwise. My all-time favorite day on Twitter was when Mark Andreessen hopped on there with an anonymous avatar, and he and Mike Solana and Mason Hartman, who are a couple of people that I recommended following, were having a conversation, and it tends to get very meta on there. So they were talking about consciousness and history and what history means, and if it's accurate, or if our perception of history is so skewed that it doesn't mean anything at all. Consciousness, if there is such a thing as the inner self, or if studies show that we should all stop wasting our time meditating, and who we are is just a bundle of memories, and the memories are skewed because we remember things how we want to remember them. And really it's just, anytime you can listen to Mark Andreessen talk about books and book recommendations, that's a good time. Sometimes it's more inane than that, but that's the way I would describe it. Is like, imagine if you could just peer into the private phone call between Mark Andreessen and Mason Hartman. It's a pretty cool thing to watch.
Well, we're really excited about getting that invite, right? Sorry. It's $3.
Yeah, just talk over each other again.
Only $3.
I can keep doing this.
I'm not the person that accepts it's basically a Google form that you fill out and then you wait. So I can't promise anything, but I can get you the form for sure.
No, I filled out my form weeks ago. I'm still in wait. Actually, from Tyler too. But if you're listening, Paul, I don't know you, but make it happen.
Austin, this has been a great conversation. We appreciate you taking time out of your day, especially kind of in the middle of all the stuff that everybody's dealing with right now. So we hope you have a great rest of the afternoon and appreciate the time.
Yeah, happy to chat. This was fun. Thanks, guys.
This was great. Thank you.
Do you ever think you would talk to an entrepreneur in Utah that's got a kind of big VC-backed business that's grown like gangbusters right now?
Well, we've definitely had some interesting guests on the show, and really nothing surprises me right now in the age of the pandemic. I mean, he is, of course, was in San Francisco and then moved back to Utah. But I think after this, people are just going to live wherever they want.
Yeah, I think living wherever you want, working wherever you want, going to school whenever you want are all really interesting themes that came out of this conversation today. Pretty intriguing.
Definitely. I don't know if you're going to now listen to this and up and move to Utah, Yasha, but if you do, I guess we can just keep doing this remotely.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, I've been locked down in my house. You've been locked down in your house. The company that I work for has gone completely virtual, as the ones that you've been a part of too. So it's a pretty fascinating learning time right now. I enjoyed this conversation a lot. I also just really love doing this podcast with you, Sunil. I love it so much that I want to make sure the one ask that we have for the people that listen to this podcast is super clear. What's that one ask?
That ask is to, if you are on your favorite podcast platform, leave us a 5-star review or whatever review that we deserve.
Yeah. Make sure you rated it as well. It helps other people find the podcast. Thanks for listening today.